Mr. Majewski's Anatomy 32 class lecture, Chapter 19, Part 1, Autonomic Nervous System Overview. So here we're going to be talking about the autonomic nervous system, the parts of our nervous system that control things that we don't consciously control. And this tends to be broken up into two main divisions. The parasympathetic division, which leads to such responses as the relaxing of the rectum, contracting of the bladder, constricting of bronchi, and so forth, which are body responses, and the sympathetic division, which again has a nerve structure that leads to particular body responses like dilated pupil, accelerated heartbeat, and so forth. So if you remember from this lovely figure, the nervous system is broken up into four parts. You've got the somatic nervous system, which are things we control, the autonomic nervous system, which are things we cannot control, and the enteric nervous system, which is specific to the GI tract and may or may not interact with the central nervous system. But so with the enteric nervous system, again, it's specific to the GI tract, can bypass the central nervous system. It's mainly broken up into two parts: the submucosal plexus in the submucosal layer of the gastric intestinal tract, and the myenteric plexus in the muscularis layer of the GI tract. And while it does communicate with the central nervous system, so we do indeed have some ideas of what's going on there, at least our brain does anyway, it is not dependent on it. Alright, back to the autonomic nervous system, the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions. So we receive autonomic sensory information from sensory receptors and neurons that take this information to the central nervous system, where it is then processed and then sent out to have autonomic motor neurons that then cause things that involuntarily that we can't consciously control, such as the contraction of smooth muscles, the contraction of cardiac muscles, and the functioning of glands. So we have the autonomic sensory receptors, such as stretch in the stomach, for instance, that sends signals to the autonomic sensory neurons that then send signals to the spinal cord and or brain. And the autonomic sensory receptors are called interoceptors because they're inside the body. They can be chemoreceptors for monitoring, say, blood composition. They can be mechanoreceptors for degree of stretch. However, what we perceive most often from these receptors is visceral pain. So usually we only know when something's going wrong. And it turns out that for the autonomic sensory neurons, we also can have somatic senses involved in this process. So for instance, if you smell baking bread, you may begin to salivate, something we can't consciously control, but we're receiving through a special sense. Alright, the main control areas in the central nervous system for autonomic functions include the hypothalamus, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. And from here, we now are sending signals out to cause a response. So these are going to leave via autonomic motor neurons from the brain or spinal cord to affect autonomic effectors. And these can include glands and smooth muscles and so forth. So it turns out most autonomic motor pathways, so this is the sending out of a signal, are a composition of at least two motor neurons in a series, so that they have to synapse at some point. So you have for instance, the sympathetic preganglionic neuron, which is myelinated. It will then synapse at the autonomic ganglion, and then will send out the axon of the sympathetic postganglionic neuron, usually unmyelinated. That'll then go to the effectors, whether it's the heart, smooth muscle, a gland. And you can see that both the sympathetic division and the parasympathetic division use this two-part chain. However, what's worth pointing out is that most of our organs have both innervation for both the sympathetic and the parasympathetic division. So we have two sets of neurons going to these glands and muscles to control what they do. So there are two main types of autonomic nervous systems motor neurons. There's the cholinergic neurons. These are the neurons that release the neurotransmitter acetylcholine. So these are very common. You see them in the preganglionic neuron of all the sympathetic and parasympathetic preganglionic neurons. And then it's also the postganglionic neurons for nerves going to signal the sweat glands, or for any of the parasympathetic division and its effectors. However, there turns out to be two types of cholinergic receptors. So even though they're sending out the same neurotransmitter, the neurotransmitter is then going to bind to one of two different kinds of receptors. The nicotine receptors, which will excite the postganglionic neuron, and muscarinic receptors, which can either excite or inhibit the effector or the that receives the signal. The second type of autonomic nervous system's motor neuron is the adrenergic neurons. The adrenergic neurons release the neurotransmitter norepinephrine, so that most sympathetic postganglionic neurons are of this kind. So only sympathetic division, but the majority of them, they're postganglionic neurons, release the neurotransmitter adrenergic, or norepinephrine, sorry. And this can either excite or inhibit the effector. Now, another thing to point out is that the sympathetic and parasympathetic nerves tend to form many plexuses throughout the trunk of the body. So an autonomic motor neuron tends not to go in a straight line, but has more of an convoluted pathway. And there are some major autonomic plexuses, and they tend to follow the major arteries of the body. And these plexuses contain the autonomic ganglia, where you have that synapsing occurring. And the largest of all these plexuses is the celiac plexus, which you would see around the celiac trunk. So many of these should have nice, easy names because they sort of explain where they are. Cardiac plexus, pulmonary plexus, esophageal plexus, renal ganglion and renal plexus, inferior mesenteric, and so forth. And that's it for this part of Chapter 19.